Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for part two of this discussion about Ohio State's role in addressing racism. This conversation, open to the university and community, is sponsored by the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, ODI, here at Ohio State. As the university observes its sesquicentennial, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion recognizes its own 50th anniversary. From its tumultuous beginnings in 1970 until today, Ohio State's ODI has stood proudly as a fierce advocate for historically underrepresented students, staff, and faculty. The world has changed over the past half century, but we've never wavered in our bedrock belief that greater inclusion has merit, that diversity brings strength, and that both should be woven into our daily work. It's important for us to honor the notable advocates of diversity who have paved the way. That's why in early 2021, we will induct the first 50 icons of inclusion into the inaugural Office of Diversity and Inclusion Hall of Fame. As you join today's session and long after it ends, we look forward to your continued commitment to join ODI in removing barriers every day in every way. At this time, I'd like to welcome Ohio State's Chief Diversity Officer and Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, James L. Moore.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. On behalf of ODI and its fabulous staff and partners, I'd like to thank our panelists for what promised to be a meaningful discussion, and I welcome those streaming at home. These are important touchstones that we can draw upon to consider how our community can be dynamic agents for social change. I like to explore why this university is so well situated to respond to systemic racism and how we can make a difference in this powerful moment. What does it mean to be a land-granted institution? It was July 1862, amidst the bloodiest days of the Civil War, when Ohio State and other first wave land-grant institutions were created by President Lincoln, signer of the Morrill Act. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize that the Morrill Act has advanced so many, but we have to remember our brothers and sisters who are Native and Indigenous, how they were impacted by the Morrill Act. But until that moment, higher education had been reserved for the most privileged and elite. This was a call to throw open the doors of higher education to the sons and daughters of farmers, shopkeepers, and factory workers. The idea to bring higher education to common people was America's first wobbly step on the road to greater inclusion in education. While a racial barrier ensured only white students would be among the first generation graduates, the dialogue about providing education for all had begun. Our conversation today is the continuation of that dialogue, begun when Lincoln put pen to paper. This notion is also found in our beloved university motto, education for citizenship. That motto gives us a charge extended beyond what we teach in our classrooms and our laboratories and into how we live together as citizens of the world. Citizenship is about participating in our society and our democracy, and should include finding ways to extend the American dream of life, liberty and prosperity to all. With more than 50,000 undergraduate students who study with us and more than 500,000 plus alumni, we have been given a platform to tackle the big questions haunting our society. Our words and actions in the classroom, in the community, reverberate throughout society. We must use our voice to spark meaningful dialogue and purposeful action. Our work must search for meaningful solutions to the problems facing Black communities and other communities of colors. We are proud that our university has responded to this call before. My own Office of Diversity and Inclusion was formed after student protests demanded more equity for Black students and other students of color at the university. More recently, the Kirwan Institute was formed to produce research that drives greater equity and inclusion to communities in Ohio and all across the United States. However, the painful truth is that we need to do much more. The next generation out in our streets right now is demanding we find new ways to bring about a more just and equitable society. As I wrap up my comments, I would like to mention an important moment from the first conversation last Monday. Dr. Don Pope Davis, Dean of the College of Education and Human Ecology, talked eloquently about how in order for us to move forward as a people, we must be capable of self-reflection on our own experiences and actions. As a Black man who grew up in the rural South Carolina, I have a set of memories and experiences that shape my views on race and racism. My colleagues all have different points of views and perspectives that they bring to the table and equally valid in their own right. Only when we explore our differences by truly listening to one another will we find common ground. That common ground then becomes the fertile land where we stand together for greater justice. I've probably taken too long here today, but give a PhD a microphone and an audience, and this is what happens. I thank our panelists again for being here today. I now toss things back to Dr. Williams, the interim director of the Women's Place. Thank you.
Thank you again so much. As a reminder to the audience, I'd like to mention that today's session is being live captioned and recorded. You may access the recording from the odi.osu.edu website later in the week. Questions from the audience are welcome throughout our discussion today through the Q&A box. Registrants also had an opportunity to pose questions in advance, and some of those are woven into our discussion, but we'll also reserve time for audience questions at the end of today's session. So now, without further ado, I'd like to be able to introduce our panelists for today. Trudy Bartley is Associate Vice President for Community Relations within the university's Office of Government Affairs, where she heads economic and community development projects and special initiatives. She also chairs Franklin County Commissioner's Poverty Assessment and Strategic Plan. Trevor Brown is Dean of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs and the Executive Dean of the Professional Colleges. The Glenn College prepares students for impactful careers in public service at the local, state, and national levels in the US and around the globe. The college also partners with public and nonprofit organizations to train public sector professionals and improve the delivery of public services to communities and citizens. Johanna Burden is director of the Wexner Center for Arts here at campus, and prior to joining the WEX, she held leadership positions in curatorial and educational departments at the New Museum in New York. Under her direction, the Wexner Center for the Arts aims to create exhibitions and programming that investigates the questions and challenges of our time. Amy Fairchild is Dean of the College of Public Health and a historian who works at the intersection of history, public health ethics, and public health policy and politics. She assesses the social, political, and ethical factors that shape the potential and limits of the state to intervene for the public good. Kathy Northern is the Robert M. Duncan Jones Day Designated Associate Professor at Moritz College of Law. She currently serves as the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and teaches in the areas of tort law and environmental justice. To support community engagement, she serves on the board of the Law and Leadership Institute, a pipeline program for underserved high school students. And Gretchen Ritter is a leading expert in the history of women's constitutional rights and contemporary issues concerning democracy and citizenship in American politics. She is the Executive Dean and Vice Provost of the College of Arts and Sciences, Ohio State's largest college that is home to 38 academic departments and schools and more than 20 centers and institutes. Thanks again to all of you for being here with us today. Even since last week, so much has developed in how the university, the city, and the nation have responded to international protest over racism and its overt and less conspicuous manifestations. In fact, in our conversation last week, we began to gather ideas about the kinds of resources that people might use to have educated conversations with one another, doing that kind of self-reflection that was brought up as one of the important points to be able to start challenging systemic racism. Many of those resources have now been gathered together in a site on the ODI page called Resources for Racial Justice, and we hope that many of you will visit those. But as we continue today, we want for people who are joining us on the panel to bring up for us more from their own disciplinary backgrounds, different sources and angles that we might take in having sincere and authentic, and most of all, impactful conversations about change. I recognize, for example, that people across the country are having these conversations. In fact, the other day I was looking at a news section online, and in that segment, an African-American female anchor was talking to one of her white female neighbors, someone who lived in the same neighborhood, although it wasn't clear that the two had interacted before. The white woman in the pair said that it was actually the first time that she and her mother were having conversations about race. And I have to say that the African-American female anchor was somewhat appalled, as she noted that her own whole life had been very much structured by systemic racism, and that many of her conversations with family, with friends, professionally, have been very much informed by the ways that she thought about race. What accounts for these different experiences? Part of the ways that we can answer this is also by thinking about what are some of the ways that different forms of art and music and performance and different commitments to honesty and to recognition can help for us to find our way through. Johanna, I know that especially given your background in thinking about art, that you've been trying to create the Wexner Center and other public viewing spaces and performance spaces that you have inhabited before as opportunities for people to be able to have these conversations. So could you share a little bit about that, about how you see the role of art playing a role here?
Absolutely. I also just wanted to take a moment to thank you, Andrea, and also James for pulling this wonderful group together in last week's conversation as well. The story that you tell is a really striking one, and I'll respond a bit to it in the sense that obviously art is not the first thing that comes to mind in moments like this when we're facing public health crisis, both in terms of COVID and in terms of racism. I think people immediately start kind of thinking about direct action. But if you look at the streets, you see how important the symbolic is. People are making art and aesthetic gestures all over. And I think historically, what's so interesting about that is that through these gestures and collective modes of messaging, there are traces left behind that also get carried forward. I know that many of us are looking back to older artworks and to artists who have led the way in these conversations for a long time. To that end, I also feel, and I often talk about art as a way that young people in particular learn about alternatives to the present that they live in. This idea that through art and culture, you can imagine other futures than the ones that you occupy. And there's something incredibly important in remembering that. However, the story that you tell, what it brings to mind for me is the way in which race is not visible to those for whom it is not urgent to address. And a lot of our recent emphasis is on images of violence and images of pain and trauma. What we don't often talk about, and I remember for me this has continued to be an incredibly important touchstone, in 1997 the English scholar Saidiya Hartman wrote a book called Scenes of Subjection, where what she actually focused on in her exploration of slave narratives were less the explicitly violent images and more the ways in which domination goes undetected through narratives of consent, of humanity, of rights, and the way in which repression actually often occurs most effusively or most consistently through images that are reinforcing white supremacy quietly. And so I think at the WEX, just to sort of speak about education and other programming that we're doing, I think we, as much as we want to highlight some of the images of radical uprising that are happening right now, we also want to show how often when race doesn't appear to be the topic, it's actually the underlying construction of supremacy and normalcy. So I feel really proud of the work that we're doing and allowing for these discussions. I will also say it's really, we have hardly done enough, and we're looking to speak of being self-reflexive at our staffing and board structure as much as the great programming that we're doing, and that's where I think our next step needs to come.
You know, that's a really great point, and being able to think about how absence as much as presence can very much work in representing the importance of race. We know that one way that many artists have been thinking about that is not only by highlighting the pictures of African Americans as the objects of violence, but being able to think too about white supremacists as the ones who are doing the kind of subjecting there. One of the kinds of controversial histories in our history is around imagery of lynching, for example. And although the images often seem to focus on the person who is the victim, there is a way that our eyes are very much drawn in some artists' rendering to thinking about who are the people who are actually there, who are the people who are actually there at a picnic with their children, to watch this and to think about that as being a kind of family unbunding, and for them sometimes patriotic act. So it's really important for us to be thinking about both these acts of presence and absence as we look at the visual representation, as well as how we tell the narratives of our nation and our institution.
Absolutely.
You know, that ends up being so important in even how we tell the stories about Ohio State. And I appreciate Vice Provost Moore today in bringing to our attention the ways that the Morrill Act of 1862, though advantageous in the long term for many of the adherents who are now here at Ohio State, came at an extreme cost, which has had a legacy of racial violence, whether direct or indirect, to many tribal nations and communities. And so one of the things that we might do as well as we're thinking about racism holistically is to look back at that moment and to think about what kinds of presences and absences need to be acknowledged in our university's history. And I invite many of you here today to be able to think about that as well. Trevor, I know you've given this some thought in your work, and also because of the ways that you're involved in public affairs.
Thank you. I'll join Johanna in thanking you and James for inviting me to be a part of this conversation, and by extension, the Glenn College. One of the things that's particularly saddening and troubling about all of the events of the last couple of weeks, and it's rooted in the question about our birth as an institution, is the failure of public institutions. So I'll just start by saying, I'll call out the name Rayshard Brooks, another person whose life was lost this week at the hands of a public institution, the Atlanta police. And that's particularly saddening. But James answered this question so well in describing the tortured birth of this institution as something in our 150th year we're celebrating. I think as we walked into this year, our sesquicentennial, and thinking back on the Morrill Act, it's just natural to celebrate all the positive things that this university has done. And yet its birth was the result of a lot of harm through the expropriation of lands from indigenous and native populations. There's two other historical events right around that time that I'd call our attention to, both very public and things that we often celebrate. The first was the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, followed by the end of the Civil War, and on June 19th, a date that hopefully many of us will be celebrating this Friday, Juneteenth, when a Union general went to Galveston, Texas, and told the slaves there that they were free. Again, a moment to celebrate, but that was quickly followed by Jim Crow, segregation, state-sanctioned policies that caused great harm to African Americans. Also, the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, which created the basis for the Transcontinental Railroad, another thing we celebrate of that era, but also a public act that caused the expropriation of lands from native populations, and through private means exploited immigrant Chinese who were very much instrumental in laying the tracks that became the basis for knitting this country together. And it's paradoxical to think that we can celebrate good things that are born of sin. And as a result, I think it's often hard for us as we think about these moments like our 150th to say, well, let's celebrate, but also acknowledge the harm. Our natural inclination is to say, well, no, let's just focus on the positive. But to make this university the great vision that Dr. Moore laid out, we have to start from that place of holding those two competing thoughts in our mind, that this university has done and will do many, many great things, but its birth is one that caused irreparable harm to populations. So as we pursue I thought the beautiful vision that Dr. Drake laid out when he came here as our president of affordability and access and inclusive excellence, as we pursue that better version of ourselves, we have to acknowledge the populations that we harm, because that creates the space for us to be able to think proactively about concrete steps that we can take to make amends and make ourselves better.
You know, your comments really bring up a kind of layered history, or a more textured history, where we can think about people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds as really contributing to the building of the university and the nation. And I think that kind of layered approach is really useful in thinking about this pandemic moment as well, that many of the ways that we are witnessing racial violence and responding to this violence is right in the middle of a pandemic, where so many communities, especially communities of color, are already experiencing the disproportionate impacts of that. And last week in some of our conversations, we were able to talk more about the kind of health risk involved, especially for African American and American Indian communities. But we want to, throughout our conversation as well, be thinking about the kind of social threats that are at stake to all of these communities, especially during this time. And your comments, Trevor, in thinking about the kind of history of exploitation of Chinese American labor also helps for us to think about this moment in which Asian and Asian American people and people from those backgrounds have increasingly been subject to discrimination and violence and xenophobia in direct relationship to the kind of misinformation that's been circulating around coronavirus. So it seems again that as we think about this kind of layered understanding of time, that these incidents are more than coincidental, and it seems really apt for us to be able to bring those together here today. I know part of the ways that we're able to do that is by thinking a bit about some of the language that has come up recently of addressing racism as a kind of public health crisis or public health issue. And maybe many of us can talk a little bit more about how that term or how that phrase is being deployed by county officials and to what end. Amy, would you like to chime in here?
I can find my unmute button. Yes, thank you very much, Andrea. I appreciate this opportunity. I thank you for continuing this conversation that we have to all stay in together for the long haul. That's been one of the challenges that we have faced, is that we have too easily let this conversation go, assuming that we have addressed it or not. Oops, I'm like trying to find my camera again. I'm losing track of stuff. Hold on. So one of the things I would make sure that we think about as if we address this pandemic moment is thinking about the sort of triple whammies, as if I've called it, but I would really now probably a quadruple whammy that African American populations and also Latino populations face. I think it's important to unpack that just a little bit. So you have populations that are less likely to have care or paid sick leave. They're more likely to be in occupations that puts one at higher risk of infection. They're more likely to have severe health outcomes if they acquire COVID-19. and now something these communities have known for a long time, but that is being pressed on our national conscience at this moment, is the ways in which these communities are policed in very different ways. And we've seen it happen in the context of protests, these moments in which issues that have long been neglected and voices that have long been silenced have been raised. And of course, that may also be increasing some of the other risks. So I think when we talk about racism as a public health problem, we're talking about sort of the ways in which century-old patterns, and Trevor covered some of those, Johanna covered some of those, covered some of those, are at work in ways that systematically undermine the health of some communities and not others. So what we consistently do in public health is think about ways in which inequities are built into our systems of housing, of education, and of access to care and policing. And one of the things that we talked about last week as part of this conversation, certainly that we've talked about, I think, in our individual colleges, is that point that Don Pope Davis made. We have to think about ourselves as individuals. We have to self-reflect, but at the same time, we have to confront the reality that we're in this situation because of very systematic and deliberate decision making. And one of the challenges that I think we see in public health in particular is that we don't have a shared narrative about the history of how we got here. Indeed, from a public health perspective, and that's been one of our themes today, that narrative, the narrative that's taken hold since the 1970s, has been a narrative of personal responsibility. It's a narrative that's born out of the incorrect assumption that we were beyond the era of infectious diseases, that we were into the realm of chronic diseases, and it was our good choices or our bad choices that made us vulnerable as individuals to heart disease, cancer, obesity. And that's one of the really insidious narratives in public health, because it neglects all of the ways in which our environments limit our choices. So as we think about racism as a public health issue and a public health crisis, I would argue that it's really important to yes, underscore the importance of individual readiness to reflect and to change, to be an anti-racist, but remember that's a start and not an end, and we have to grapple with our history and I would come to a shared understanding of how we got to this place.
It seems too that as you're talking about the kinds of environmental determinants that can impact people's health as well, that this is really a moment too to think about the kinds of ways that racial trauma and the kinds of stressors of just being in this moment might be contributing to the impact on people's health. I know that for many people who are listening, they may say, let's imagine that you have two employees who are both working at Ohio State and they both have the same level of health insurance. What kinds of things would account for why one is getting better health service than another, do you think?
Well, but even if you get the same level of health service, there's a really important literature, and as the historian, I'm not the best one to review it, but there's a really important literature that talks about the ways in which past historical experiences, community experiences, really do shape health outcomes in populations that otherwise might seem to be very similar. And that's one of the really insidious qualities of some of the inequities that we're faced with today. And we see it not only play out when it comes to race and racism, but when it comes to gay rights and LGBTQ plus communities. We see it manifest in so many different ways.
It seems useful then that part of the way that the university wants to begin or continue addressing systemic racism then is through addressing public health as one of the kind of major tenets of a plan that Dr. Drake laid out last week. So I started my conversation earlier by saying that so much has changed even in this 1 week. And on Wednesday, Dr. Drake recently announced the formation of a university task force to address institutional racism, greater attention to public health, and then also a $1 million fund for seed grants to study and eradicate racial development and kind of racial disparities around those. We know that many of you on the call today are involved in a number of kind of initiatives here already that are interested in challenging some of those kinds of disparities. And so now seems a great opportunity to bring an opportunity to and more attention to some of those partnerships and to maybe even imagine or envision how this gives us a new charge and a new call to be able to challenge some of those systemic patterns and habits that already exist there. I know that Trudy's work is especially engaged in drawing on community engagement practices, and others of you too can chime in as we go as well. But Trudy, let me turn to you at this point and ask for you to talk a little bit about how, whether through the kind of seed grants that Dr. Drake has recently announced or through other initiatives, the university can really be leading the state and the nation, and especially the city of Columbus and surrounding areas in addressing some of these issues.
Andrea, thank you. And again, thank you and Dr. Moore for this opportunity to really talk about some of the work that the university is partnering and collaborating with not only the city of Columbus, but also with Franklin County. As a Black woman myself, you know, the events that have happened in the last 4 weeks have really been traumatizing, in that they bring back to individuals such as myself those experiences that they have experienced themselves. You feel like you're carrying Breonna Taylor and George Floyd around with you, even though what you've experienced may not have been as drastic due to the fact that you were still alive. But it's still those traumatic experiences that they bubble back up to the surface. And they make you look at not only your city that you live in, but the place that you work in. And you know that every time that you go through the door, you're looked at as a Black or a white or a Latino woman. And you're not looked at the same, even though people believe they are colorblind. That colorblindness doesn't exist because people see color. It's just that their experiences really show how they respond to you. And that is due to the fact the interactions they've had with people who are different than themselves. But with the university, what I would say is that the $1 Million Fund is a phenomenal way to begin to look at what currently is happening in our city. It's not about replicating the plans and the discussions and the topics that we have been talking about in the county in Central Ohio for the past 2 years. But it is, how does a university from a faculty and staff standpoint get engaged with what is currently happening with the Rise Together Blueprint? The Rise Together Blueprint is a poverty plan where we went out and we talked to individuals who were in poverty, and we asked them, what is your biggest barrier to success? And they let us know what that was. And we had 200 meetings around the county to talk to folks. And then we went the next step and we talked to those nonprofits that provide services to those individuals. And we said, here's what we heard. Here are the barriers that we heard from individuals who want to have success, but are having problems getting there. So how do we change that? And what came out of that was systemic racism. Because in many of the organizations that individuals work with, there are not people who look like themselves. They're not people who have the same experiences that they've had. So that there is a disconnect as far as you're here, you want to get here, how do I help you get there? And there's a disconnect in that the people who are helping do not look like the individuals. And so there's a cultural gap there. And so that's why we're seeing the needle has not moved. We went from there and we brought this information back to the Executive Leadership Council, and we said, what we're hearing throughout the county, throughout Central Ohio, is that racism is systemic. Whether you're looking for housing, whether you're looking, if you're food insecure, whether you're looking at transportation, whether you're looking at promotional opportunities, whether if it is workforce development, whether it's jobs and promotional opportunities, or it's the benefits cliff that is keeping you down from taking that promotion because you'll have the opportunity to lose your benefits. So we brought all that together. We came up with 13 goals and 120 action steps, and that's called the blueprint for the Rise Together Blueprint. So what I'm looking at is that Ohio State 43210 is a microcosm of what is happening in Central Ohio. Because from a student standpoint, we have food insecurity for our students. We have housing insecurity for our students. Sometimes there's connectivity, lack of connectivity as far as being able to do what we're seeing with COVID, how that revealed. We're seeing transportation issues. We're seeing that with faculty and staff, there may not be those promotional opportunities that others have been able to have access to that you don't have access to. So we really need to look at not restudying what has already been studied, but look intently at ourselves, look at our different levels, look at our board, look at our senior leadership, look at our different colleges, look at we have improved in the diversity of the student body that we've included, but it's about how do we connect to what has been studied to have action. Because right now it's the urgency of now. It's been 400 years where there have been laws and policies and legislation has impacted people of color from building wealth and from educational opportunities. So we know that, and we have to be uncomfortable with having those uncomfortable conversations. We have to be willing to be politically incorrect and ask those questions. And we can't be sensitive when someone challenges you as a dean or as a professor and says, but what about this? And what about me? And did you look at finding other people? So therefore we have diverse voices around the table. So that's how I look at what we can do as an institution, looking at what our students are saying they're experiencing, what our faculty is saying they're experiencing, what our staff saying they're experiencing, and how we can put all of that together, utilize this fund, so therefore we can build a more equitable institution.
You know, that's great in terms of, I'm sure that many of us weren't as familiar with the kind of process that already the university has been engaged with joining with community organizations and so on to really survey and assess and get more of a sense of what everyday residents of Columbus and the surrounding area are facing. And we understand that we want to challenge those kinds of ideas about Ohio State and other higher education institutions being the kind of ivory tower that is isolated from what the city and what the community needs or has to offer, that we're really setting up those kinds of reciprocal relationships here. And thinking not that we are the brain trust giving out to the power, but really thinking about how the answers to questions that are even on our campus might exist beyond our campus itself. So setting up that kind of reciprocity through the office that you have and through the kinds of initiatives of outreach and engagement and the kinds of things that people are doing in their individual campus student activities, through their research practices, through the Kirwan Institute, all works together in advancing many of those kinds of issues. I know public affairs necessarily is involved in this as well, and kind of thinking about how to prepare leaders on this campus who will be the ones making ethical decisions when they are on the other side of our degrees in positions in the city and the county and so on. And so Trevor, I know that you all have also some kind of programs that have been associated with building out the capacity of Ohio State.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And rather than go through the various programs, because I know that there are lots of units here represented in this call, public health is very active with the state in the COVID crisis, and the Moritz College of Law has a lot of clinics that it does, helping people who are struggling in the judicial system. I think I just highlight how important it is for this university to embrace its outreach and engagement responsibility. So often we start by saying we're a Research One university, and I think President Drake is to be commended for focusing like a laser beam on the teaching and learning mission of this university. And I think in our next era, and this moment we're in right now really emphasizes our next phase should be around outreach and engagement in the way that I thought Trudy just did such a great job describing. And there's so many units on campus. Johanna's work is as much about informing and engaging the community outside of the university as it is inside of the university. The Glenn College was created as that integrator here on campus around public policy issues and then connecting it to public decision makers. I think we all need to embrace that role as we look to this next phase of the university's growth.
And Johanna, I know too, the kinds of programs for youth that you all do, especially give us an opportunity to start changing some of the attitudes around race and addressing difference as part of our educational mission, not only for students here, but also for K-12 students, correct?
Absolutely. And our education programs, I come out of education, and you know, for those of you who are familiar with museums, you know that often diversity work, that's where it's tucked, is in the education department. And these folks are asked, and I've been in those departments for a long time, to sort of make right what the rest of the institution doesn't have to think about. And so I've been really fortunate at the WEX to inherit an amazing team led now by Dion Custer-Edwards, who's been thinking about access and inclusion as fundamental to how we build new audiences for the future. And part of the point that I was trying to make earlier, and I would make again here, is that when we're doing community outreach, we have to also make sure that when we're working with whatever age range, that those folks don't feel that they're being tasked with all of the work of talking about these issues. And so when somebody sort of, for instance, comes into the museum and there's a show of monochromatic paintings, they're also about race. They're about legacies of value setting, of visibility. And I think interestingly, we talk about our sweet spot being the 14 to 24-year-olds, that they teach us what we should be thinking about. So as much as it's community engagement, it's also a mode of really kind of thinking about the future alongside young people. And that's very moving and exciting. So so I'm really glad to talk about, I mean, K through 12 is they're our next generation. And the families that come with them sometimes wouldn't come to the museum without these little ones alongside them. They're incredibly important to be targeting and bringing in, but oftentimes they have no relationship to art or the museum until they come and to one of our programs. So I feel like education should be the center of the museum, not the sidebar that does the explaining.
Exactly. And you know, we've been talking thus far about narratives, about how the university shapes its own narratives, about how some of those narratives are shaped as art. But also part of what we highlight as educators is that there are narratives even around what we consider as fact and objective fact. And as the Dean of Arts and Sciences, I'd like to bring in Gretchen Ritter on this and having for us to think about how with the humanities and arts and sciences in general, these are conversations that a number of professors, admittedly across the campus, but especially in the heart of the campus in arts and sciences, are aiming to have, to think about what are going to be those kinds of teaching and learning practices that can really help for us to address race and ethnicity and histories of oppressions in more robust ways there. So what is your kind of aim or goal or vision for how arts and sciences as one of the major colleges on campus is going to be contributing to much of this work of the kinds of narratives that we're shaping together?
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it's great for me to be here with colleagues today to talk about all of this we do work around these issues from all over the college, as you well know. Our AAAS department is involved in thinking about the narratives in the literature of the experience of Africans and African Americans, and does a lot of work through the Community Engagement Center on the East Side as well. Our Center for Urban Regional Analysis is thinking about how disparities related to transportation have differential impacts on opportunity and social mobility. Our science departments are deeply engaged in K-12 outreach, especially with underserved communities. We work a lot with the Kirwan Center. We have very distinguished scholars who are working in literature and in history around many of these issues. Our Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program is doing a lot of work around prison education. And we know that incarceration disproportionately impacts communities of color. But I think one of my goals in all of this, and I should also add, we've just launched in the last year a certificate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's available not just to our students, but to our staff, to our alumni, to help equip people in whatever realm of life to be champions for these issues in their professional lives and their community lives. I think as I think about this, my goal is for all of us collectively to be thinking about how we can help to own this issue, to be thinking every day, how do we make a positive difference in this regard? And that's in our role as teachers, that's in our role as members of a land-grant institution, where we're coming together with folks in other colleges as well to say, how do we help to solve this critical community issue collectively?
And that's great that you highlight how so many departments across campus can be addressing this, whether in physics or in history or in other kinds of science fields, in addressing, because we know that what often happens, even with well-intended professors, is that when the conversation of race comes up in a classroom, that everybody turns around and looks at the one student, or if it's in the office, looks at the one colleague who comes from that non-white racial and ethnic background. And I think what's going to be central to really addressing race and racism is to also think about whiteness as its own construct, and to be able to tap into understandings of white privilege. And so I want to open this up more generally to the floor and get us to think about, how can Ohio State be examining whiteness and white privilege?
One of the things I would say to that immediately is, you can't understand American history without understanding this. You can't understand the history of voting rights. You can't understand the history of unions and the labor movement. You can't understand patterns of home ownership without understanding the way that race and whiteness in particular have sort of shaped who we are as a country. You can't understand our economic success without appreciating how slavery created the foundation for a lot of that. So I think part of our role of educating people to be citizens needs to be that broader education as well. And to go back to the point that you made a minute ago about, let's not put the burden on colleagues of color, staff, faculty, and students. I think it's an important responsibility for all of us to be educated about this history, to know the facts, and to be contributors to helping us to realize our ideals of being a society that provides equality, justice, and opportunity for everyone.
Your comments there also help for us to think about how law fits into this. And so I'd like for Kathy to kind of join our conversation too, from this angle of thinking about how we're examining race, and especially how we're examining whiteness and white privilege across the campus, and how a background, for example, in law and some of the other fields can help for students as well as faculty and staff to start addressing some of these issues.
Thank you, Andrea. And I just want to join with others in thanking you for this opportunity and look forward to engaging in these conversations from now going forward. I think that one of the things that have been brought up by many of our panelists today is just the broad extent to which systemic racism and issues of systemic racism impact every aspect of what we do. From the perspective, particularly of lawyers in training students to be lawyers, lawyers are to be problem solvers. And one of the most greatest underlying problems that we have is questions of systemic racism and how does that fit in? So one of the things we're doing is challenging all of our faculty to think about ways in which systemic racism has influenced the development of law. Our goal is to help students to understand by the time that they leave the law school, not just what the rule of law is now, but how it came to be and how various structures influence. For example, well, let me use an example maybe in terms of how we're thinking about this. If you talk to someone who is very interested in, gaming, you're engaged in working through level programming that provides you various levels of challenges and conflicts, and before you can go to the next level, you have to correct, you have to solve the problem for us to move forward as a country. And for the institution, the justice system, the range of systems of ways in which law directly impacts everything that we do, whether it's public health, economy, the criminal justice system, law interplays in all of those things. Systemic racism has been an underpinning of challenge, of barrier to this society moving forward to accomplish all that it could accomplish. And until we figure out ways to address that systemic racism, our justice system, our rule of law, which we're based on as a country, is based upon the rule of law. Until we meet those challenges, we can't move to the next level as a country. And so in terms of thinking within our own college, helping students to understand in each of their courses, not just in criminal law or civil rights or constitutional law, those kind of courses that kind of naturally lend themselves to the discussion. How do we inform ourselves, this notion of self-reflection? How do we inform ourselves about how systemic racism impacts each and every aspect of the courses that we teach? I use an example from my own kind of self-reflection. I teach tort law, and it deals with personal injury and damages for those personal injury. And it's not kind of naturally attuned to issues of race or to gender. But if you look more deeply into your subject area, for example, in mine, the way in which damages are awarded are based upon educational attainment, economic attainment, jobs, etc. If I'm someone who is an attorney who's looking to represent somebody, and my question is kind of at the end of the day, what are the damages that this lawsuit may generate? I'm looking at those factors. If I don't understand that systemic racism plays a role in how we value injury to individuals very differently based upon income and education and the racial implication, the systemic racism that has led to those differences, then we don't recognize that often people of color don't have the same access to the justice system, because at the end of the day, the financial reward associated with representing them may not result in even having representation. So you have to think through, whether it's business law, land use plan, the range of things. How does systemic racism impact what we do? And I think that extends out beyond an obvious area, if you will, like the College of Law, where we're training people to be leaders, we're training people to represent in the justice system, we're training people to be problem solvers. How does systemic racism impact throughout the academy? And other speakers have spoken to that.
Right. And I know too, part of your work is around environmental justice. And so that seems really relevant here as well. But I'm imagining your kind of average student sometimes comes in and says, the law is right, and the law is equal, and the law is objective. And so those seem to be really pertinent points for us to use those kinds of case studies to be able to point out the longer history of, first of all, who was given access to make the law, who was given access to make the policy, and might they have then created that to their own benefit in a way that later it was made to come across as objective, but that doesn't have objective or neutral consequences there. I want to have us to dig into this a little bit more, because again, as I was getting questions before this session, so many people said, we really need to dig into how can we get our colleagues, how can we get our leaders, how can we get the person who's in the cubicle next to us to think about the kinds of ways that they're making decisions about how they run our office, or what they think the priorities of our unit should be based on their own kind of investment in white privilege there. So I want to invite other people on the panel here too to think about what are some of the things that you've put in place, whether they're individual practices or reviews of policy, that help for you to think about how to dig into white privilege and privilege.
So, Andrea, I'm just going to go back to what we did at the county, just in general, because we found that there are people who still really don't believe systemic racism exists. So if there's a belief that it doesn't exist, or it only exists in certain areas, you need people to be on the same level or playing field of understanding. And that's really about history. And so there is a university that shall remain nameless that is in North Carolina that has a racial justice training that's 2 intensive days of just history of what has happened since 1618 to today. And it goes right to what Kathy is talking about as far as laws and policies that were put in place intentionally, that people of color could not be educated or build wealth. And after 16 hours of that training, we went around the room and we asked all the white people, after they went through this training, what is it that you like about being white? And they said, number 1, I don't have to think about it. Number 2, I am always given a pass. Number 3, I can make a mistake and not really suffer any consequences. You went around the table again and you asked African Americans and Blacks and people of color, what is it that you like about being who you are? And many of the answers were cultural. I like, I like my color. I like my curly hair. I like that we are very engaging and we're this. They weren't the economic pieces of every day. They were cultural things. But it was very telling that there were many people who were white, who were in the room, who never really thought about what it was to be a person of color, and some of the things that you take for granted that people of color deal with each and every day. So I'm saying this to say this. we at this university have got to start on a level playing field to understand why it is, how it is, and then from there start having those conversations. Because if you start with people thinking, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see color, then that's a problem in itself. But if you have people who are really being insightful and being intentional about looking at themselves and then having the conversation, then I think we can move towards action and change.
So Trudy, can I add something here, Andrea?
Yes.
I had been stuck on something you said the very first time you spoke, when you talked about the importance of bringing diverse voices around the table and the willingness to be politically incorrect. And, you know, so as much as we talk about having a shared narrative, and I think everybody here shares that narrative, but we came to it by grappling with counter narratives. And as a land-grant university, as any university, that's the really hard thing I think we do as researchers, as teachers, as people engaged in public debate, is we have to grapple with those counter narratives, and we do it through evidence. But we also do it in a context not only in which the narratives are contested, but which the evidence is often contested. So I think about the debate that students are asking us to have right now about breaking ties with the Columbus Department. This is someplace I would like to know the evidence, but just knowing what I know, there are going to be different models and different conceptions of what the consequences are, different paths that we can take. And it seems to me that that's going to be one of the really politically challenging conversations that we have to have with ourselves and that we have to have as a community. So it's not so much the idea of studying again what's already been studied, but taking this terrain of evidence and using our expertise to figure out the best way forward. I mean, it's something we've been doing in the context of COVID-19. We're working in this context of uncertainty, and we've been able, on a really, Don Pope Davis makes this point, on a really grand scale, to collectively figure out a way forward in the face of competing narratives, competing uncertainty, and that's the challenge we face, and it's hard to have those conversations when you have narratives of white supremacy that you need to grapple with in the classroom and in public life as well.
Can I make a quick contribution here as well? My chair of the history department just wrote to me to say, I'm sure you've got this on your radar, but make sure folks know about the 1619 project from the history department here. So we've got folks who are thinking and talking publicly and trying to help educate people exactly on some of the questions, Trudy and Amy, that you all are talking about. And I do think that getting to a starting point where you can have meaningful dialogue means a commitment to engagement and to learning about history. And I do want to come back again to say that I believe that the efforts that we're making in the context of our new diversity, equity, and inclusion certificate are an attempt to equip people to do just that. It's not often that people are ill-willed, it's that there's a lot that they don't know. And if you can take the time to walk it through, I think the odds that you're going to be able to join together in positive efforts grow a lot.
Can I just jump in? Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to say, it's interesting between what Gretchen, Amy, and Trudy have just said, these kind of multiple, the strands of the empirical versus the kind of affective or individual, and how those run together. I think it's, at least in terms of the field that I occupy, really important that we can hear each other's stories without thinking that we relate to them fully. And the idea of empathy as something that actually I think often gets utilized incorrectly as an idea of over-identifying. And as I heard Trudy speak about people going around the table, being able to believe each other when we tell stories about how things affect us is something that's really interesting. there's the empirical evidence, and then there's how different bodies are affected by different realities. And I think it's really important in the arts to use these spaces for those different narratives and counter narratives and narratives that haven't been told, to find space. There's an intimacy that we're finding in the field right now where people really want to talk to each other. And I think really kind of thinking about how to, obviously we have tons of huge systemic work to do, but it's also about knowing each other and trusting each other. And I would say, at least for my own unit, a lot of what's happening now is internal to staff discussions that feel really fundamental to any change that we could make in terms of outward facing or public facing programs. So I think that's also really key, is just to point out again that there are a lot of, at least in the museum field, demands for kind of public performance of statements and action items. And a lot of people are sticking work by Black artists on their websites as though that proves something. But I think instead it's interesting to talk about how the work has to be done over time. And again, just to think about the empirical and the narrative as I think related, but not the same. And that's really interesting too.
I'm going to fold in here two concerns that have come in from the audience around these issues, of saying that as we talk about these issues, sometimes with having open conversations, I've also heard the words uncomfortable come up. I've heard the words narrative and counter narrative come up, but the audience draws our attention by saying, one, how do these issues and staging them in our conversations, whether in the office or the classroom, have to do with academic freedom? And secondly, is the university or individual constituents at the university, are we afraid of alienating certain parts of our audience, and especially alums and donors, by taking on issues of racism face forward?
And I think, Andrea, in one respect, we can hide behind those concerns about how we will impact, potentially alumni or donors or the government. But one of the key aspects of academic freedom is that we're charged with helping to educate our students on how to have these difficult conversations, on how to inquire about the information they're being provided, how to learn how to discern fact from opinion, how to, for their own education, to be able to make those inquiries, to be able, in the context of that conversation, learn how to listen. We spend a lot of time in education learning how to, teaching people how to speak, how to write, how to convey, but often not how to listen, to be empathetic, to question whether their own reaction to a statement is based upon fact or based upon actually a fear that a belief that they've long held may be wrong. So how do we think about learning how to help people take the students take other viewpoints into account, exposing them to a range of perspectives, helping them to understand how to have those conversations in a respectful manner where they allow for discomfort, they allow for disagreement. We're not really trying to indoctrinate, we're trying to educate. And part of that is presenting these different points of view. That being said, one of the, I think Dr. Moore made the point earlier, it's not the role of students to educate the faculty or each other. It's not the role of an African-American student or person to be the spokesperson for everyone. The faculty and staff bear responsibility for understanding within their own context, within their own areas, where systemic racism has an impact, and then questioning the self-reflection piece that we started on. How do my own views, how do my own approaches, how do I teach this subject matter? How do I model how to have these discussions? That's what we ought to be helping our students to understand not only the underlying factual information
Right.
about systemic racism and about other things that have influenced so much policy, but
Right.
how to
Right.
carefully think about them and to move forward, how to begin thinking about how to solve problems.
Great,
Can-
great. Mhm.
Can I add a comment on here as well? You know, I think we should be conveying to our alumni, our trustees, our donors, that it is in all of our interests to address structural racism. If you think in terms of our well-being as a society, I mean, the research shows that more diverse communities are more innovative, they're more economically successful, they're more healthy as democracies. We're not going to be able to solve some of the great problems that we are challenged with right now if we ignore the talents and the ambitions and the contributions of large segments of our society. There are plenty of conservatives who are committed to civil rights and to equal opportunity. We should be finding ways to partner with them and moving this forward.
Great, thanks. I want now to have us to turn to additional questions from our audience, and I think that we've already laid a great foundation for doing so. Largely, audience members are saying, okay, this is great, where do we go from here? And I want to bring to your attention 3 things that have come up from either student concerns over the past week, faculty, and petitions going around campus, and have you to respond to thinking about what would it take for Ohio State to be able to consider some of those things. One is how to build greater accountability for racial misconduct by tenured professors and staff with seniority who cannot or are not easily dismissed. How does the issue of tenure complicate this, of holding professors and instructors accountable, or staff with seniority? And what would it take for Ohio State to start thinking about building greater accountability? How might we begin moving in that direction?
Well, since I'm not a dean of a dean, and so I don't have to address some of the individual faculty and some of my colleagues might. I think as much about helping each of those individuals to understand how they might advance in their reputation, their careers, the opportunities that they have by embracing the notion of education for citizenship. I think we can become so invested in our own kind of narrow area of inquiry that we don't tie it into expectations of the university's core goal and core missions. Part of that is potentially building those types of considerations into tenure and promotion decisions. You know, how has the individual helped the student to better become a better citizen, better equipped to be a citizen in regards to their discipline? I mean, they're in a subject area when I'm discipline. Conversations, you know, our deans having conversations with faculty members that would go to how might they themselves broaden their understanding of how these issues influence their discipline. I noted, for example, even in math or science, if there was a movie out, Hidden Figures, and it addressed the women, the African-American women who are critical to NASA's initial space launches. And they were mathematicians, and yet they were hidden. Why? What aspects of racism or sexism, why they were hidden? How might you envision your own area, your own particular path to success, the national reputation in which you're hold. You know, some positive aspects of encouraging people to broaden their own views. For the truly recalcitrant, there are means short of dismissal that deans might use to help influence or encourage behavior. Are you getting to teach the hours that you want? Are you, you know, there are a number of decisions made that impact our teaching short of dismissal that might be used as carrots and or as sticks, if you will. But that's easy for me to say because I don't have to make those decisions.
I think one of the things that Dean Ritter was emphasizing earlier too was to get us to think about how it is within the best interest for the mission that we have as academic units in many units, or for the kind of business models that we have as support units to actually be able to embrace more of those inclusive patterns there. And with that in mind, I also want to bring up another audience question in saying that our conversations often have focused on faculty and students, but let's turn our attention equally to staff, both as contributors to this contribution, to this conversation, and as recipients of the enhanced models for investing in diversity and inclusion. I would also like to mention that we have a number of people on the call who are calling us actually from corporations or places outside the university. So what are some ways that we could model diversifying staff, or even more than that, beyond personnel, thinking about making diversity key in our business practices, in our styles and structures of meeting, in our vendors, in other kinds of ways that we think about staff contributions and our business practices writ large?
I can start. I don't have a complete answer. There are lots of really important questions packed in there, but I think one important place to start is to treat everybody as a partner. I think often in the higher ed context, we focus on students and faculty, but staff are equal partners in the whole enterprise. And I think having separate conversations is important on the one hand, because some of the differences that exist between those populations are distinct. But fundamentally, we're all involved in the same endeavor. And so rather than have a separate conversation around these issues for faculty and a separate for students, I think you have to find ways to bring everybody together so that staff feel that they are equal voices in this conversation. And again, there are lots of different dimensions that matter in each of those roles, and you should be sensitive to those. What happens in the classroom is a little bit different than what might happen in an office context, but fundamentally some of these issues are the same. And so one of the things we try to do in the Glenn College is to empower staff to be equal participants and equal voices in these conversations.
So Trevor, bringing that up reminds me of one of the great programs that we have here at OSU, which is the Art of Hosting Conversations That Matter. So I think on the one hand, it's really important to state as a principle. On the other hand, principles live in our interactions with people, and we have to think about the ways we structure meetings. Or do we say one thing and then have meetings where the same folks dominate, or are we willing to rethink our structures and use meetings in a way to dig into issues in formats that gives everybody an opportunity to participate? Indeed, makes it hard not to participate if you're there. And I think too, in reflecting on the last question, I don't want to end this session with the idea that the deans aren't willing to talk about how do you deal with faculty behavior. And I think, in some ways it happens in the same way, that if we approach it as a kind of top-down, there's a moment for top-down punitive actions, but there's a level at which we can adopt procedures. And I'm thinking of the cup of coffee conversation project that's come out of Vanderbilt, where you can do a training to enable a staff member, a junior faculty member, to go and have a conversation with somebody who has committed a microaggression and say, hey, did you know that when you said this to this person, it had this effect on them? Not as a way to adjudicate it, but as a way to begin as colleagues to make each other aware. And my own feeling is that sort of policies and procedures in place, again, policy doesn't matter. It's the spaces in which it gets enacted. We have to create these spaces in which we're willing to talk to each other. We're willing to share in ways that allow people to hear, that make it clear what mistakes were made, and give people an opportunity to reflect and engage. But even at the, when you get to the top down level, you don't get through these things without challenging conversations with people, whether it's a dean or a department chair, bringing somebody in and beginning this process of discussion. That's where it all begins.
So can I just add, you were saying that you have corporations that are also listening in.
Right.
I mean, you really have to intentionally, and this just really gets back to corporations, particularly those who, let's say, have federal contracts. They have compliance reviews, and there are certain standards that they have to meet as far as percentages and looking like the areas that they serve. So that means Ohio State needs to, at each of its colleges, at each of its units, at each of its departments, needs to intentionally look at your senior leadership around the table on Monday morning and say, do all these people look like the folks that I am serving in my college, in my university, in my department, in whatever service that I am offering the university? That's where it has to start if there's going to be change, because you need to understand what the discrepancies are, what the gaps are, before you can actually start looking at what the change is going to be. So therefore, you have that diverse conversation around the table. As Dean Ritter has said, the most, I think, impactful and productive nonprofits, corporations, entities are those that have a diverse group. And so we have got to do that at OSU and each of our colleges, in each of our departments, in each of our units, to look around that table and say, what am I missing, or am I not missing anything?
And
yeah.
And I think also the aspect of signaling. We need to signal from the time that we are interviewing people that we take concerns about diversity and inclusion seriously. I saw a list of maybe about 120 questions that might potentially be used to talk to staff and faculty in interviews, and to assess a range of skills. Out of that 120 questions, there might have been 2 or 3 that had anything to do with diversity at all. And until we signal from the very beginning and inquire of people that we're bringing into the faculty and to the staff, what it is that they can contribute to diversity. And contributing to diversity is not limited to whether or not you're a diverse individual. Until we begin to really signal the importance at every level, from the very beginning of when people comes in. That way, when we get to the point of where we're looking at who's around the table making decisions, the importance of that, having diverse people contributing, is something that is just intrinsic to our whole organizational structure.
I would
go right ahead.
I would add to that you know, our staff are often leaders in this. I mean, I learn a ton from the ideas and suggestions that are brought forth to me from staff from various parts of the college. Our staff advisory group, among others, is one of the places where I think we're getting some good leadership on these issues. I also think we have to make this a core part of our mission that everybody owns, everybody. right? In my performance conversations with all my direct reports this year, one of my key questions is, how are you making a difference on this score? I should be held accountable to that too, right?
And I just wanted to jump in and sort of say something similar too, which is, Trudy, as you're talking about looking around the table and seeing what's not there, as that starts to change constitution, I think I'll speak for museums right now. I think the question of what the structure is, who it serves, and what it does begins to morph as well. I mean, museums are historically some of the, some of the worst cultural appropriators, and are looking at who they serve. And it's gone, I think, it started to move from this model of teaching on, which Kathy's talking about, and more towards engagement with. I mean, I've literally seen the museum field change from being object-oriented to audience-oriented. And you look at places like the library that has been able to do this in a much more kind of effective and visible way. And I guess I would just say, to your point, as we change the constitution of who's around the table itself will change shape. And I think that's something we have to figure out how to anticipate and support as well. And I agree, it's by changing things like leadership structures from being completely hierarchical to more sort of collectively produced.
That's great. I'd like for us to take this from another angle with one more question from the audience. Even as we talk about sometimes changing the very composition of personnel, we've had on the call for the last couple of weeks and some emails in between, a number of communications from OSU Extension, where some of the OSU Extension educators mention, and I quote here, "I live in a rural part of Ohio that is 98% white, as are many of our rural Ohio areas. Are there different kinds of approaches that we could be taking to be agents of change when there's less of a chance that the actual demographics will change, but the possibility that the attitudes and practices can change?" What are some other kinds of approaches that could be used in those circumstances?
Andrew, I think potentially one thing is perhaps illustrated best by what we're doing now, and that is communicating across a range of ideas with people who are not necessarily physically present in that space. And I think work with the extension opportunities in the more rural areas could be used to have those virtual conversations, to introduce concepts and things where people can have conversations with people who they may not ever interact with in their day-to-day lives, just regularly in a meeting or at a coffee shop or something else. How can we really open up the diversity that are in some aspects of our state, but particularly on campus, to others? And so the conversations don't have to be just limited to the people who are physically present in a county for that conversation. And we need to maybe use what we're learning now from this kind of COVID-enforced way of communicating on a more regular basis and extend that to our rural areas. Those voices can interact without having to be physically present.
I think that's a great conversation there for us to be able to think about the ways that the university, especially during this moment of COVID, has been taking the lead to think about what are the kinds of contributions that Ohio State can be making. And it's in this, again, overlapping moment that we think about both racism as public health crisis and the other forms of public health crises that are going on, that OSU is extending out some of its research, some of its models of community engagement to be able to lend towards that there. What would we say in our concluding moments is the kind of core of how we want the university to lead? I'll say, as Susan Basso and perhaps others have often said in recent meetings, that people will remember how you treat them in a moment like this. this. And it is imperative for all of us then to be able to make sure that as we're moving forward, we do so with the best interests of not only the university, but our whole Ohio State and state community at large. And with that, my friends, I'd like to conclude and thank you again for joining us so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And I'd like to remind you as well that all of these comments and video will be available for you later on the odi.osu.edu website later in the week. Thank you and goodbye.